I'm Tom King. I'm the founder of Toolkit.law, and we are here on a special 30-minute presentation on child welfare, child exposure, and resiliency. And we've got a diverse group of attorneys here in America as we present this continuing legal education event to the 80 plus countries with English-based legal systems. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves with about a 20 to 30-second summary. Stephanie Neal-Johnson, go ahead, please.
It was a pleasure to be with all of you today. I've spent some time in litigation and spent a lot of time in the community working and counseling and supporting the work of those who protect and support the victims and their families in domestic violence situations.
And you're up in Boston,
In
Massachusetts.
Boston. Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Stephanie, Proffitt in our jurisdiction of the state of Texas within America, you are one of the rare attorneys who are double board certified in both family law and child welfare law. And for all the other attorneys who are watching, you also specialize in testifying in malpractice cases against other attorneys outside of your area, which is amazing, right?
Yes, don't tell people the last part. Doesn't make me very popular. But yes, I am a family law attorney and a child welfare attorney, board certified in both. And I've been doing this for a little over 26 and a half years. And on occasion, I get contacted to testify as an expert witness in malpractice cases around the state.
And you're one of the attorneys who did it right. You were first a paralegal, right?
That's correct. I was a paralegal for, including the 3 years of law school, 9 years I was a paralegal. Actually had my own paralegal firm in California because as Kim Kardashian has taught us, you don't have to necessarily go to law school to almost practice law. Paralegals can actually do everything up to going to court with a pro se client. So did that for 9 years and then got my law license and moved to Texas.
Phineas, I've known you for more than 4 decades. I know you'd prefer to be dressed up for us, but you just got out of the hospital, but you insisted on being here. Over 4 decades in law enforcement, over 4 decades in EMS, retired police chief, having also been a sheriff's deputy, and you also have a very special law affiliation with Indian nations and specialty. Tell us about that, please.
Uh, you know, I was blessed to work in Indian country as a federal criminal investigator, doing major crimes for the Indian nations that I worked for under the auspices of the FBI as a task force officer. And I think Indian law is the most fascinating realm of law that there is. And I was actually admitted to the Spokane Tribes Bar Association. So I feel it's kind of fun to be a policeman and a kind of a lawyer. It makes me feel like I fit in with all you guys.
So, and Phineas is near Seattle, Washington, for those of you who are outside the United States. For those inside North America, he's near the Spokane area in a garden paradise known as Wilbur, Washington, where I was blessed to spend time with him and his wife. We're going to go now and share my screen. I'm going to show the help sheet that everyone's going to be following along with. We've assigned a column to each of them. Moving it onto the screen now. The topic is child exposure and resiliency. And we look at the first column about the impact that trauma can have on children. Phineas, I couldn't ask for a better expert than you on this. Walk us through what do you want to share with us about this column?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that children show us when they're hurting. The question is whether we as attorneys or policemen or social workers or anybody else invested in the system, if we pay attention to the signs, we need to be looking for the issues that they're not going to necessarily bring up. But if you start to really work with these people and talk to them, and most importantly, listen to them, just a few questions, pointed questions, will give you a lot of insight. When you say, "Hey, how's that child doing?" and the parent says, "Oh, they're doing great." Okay, you know what? They're breathing and they're alive, and that's great. We're happy for that. But you need to dig in just a little bit deeper. I mean, is the kid sleeping at night? Are they showing problems? Are they unusual problems? Bedwetting is not taboo to ask about. You know, that's a real telltale look into what's going on with these little ones. And don't don't hesitate to bring in people that they may not have the pedigree that you have academically, but have the practical skills of working with these kids. you know, get them involved with some of these kids. You'll see pretty fast when there's a problem, we are addressing it and we're moving forward to protect the child and do all that kind of stuff. It's
You
not hard to
talked
see
about you
who's
talked
doing
about
great.
yeah, you talked about preschool children and indicators. What about middle school and teenagers? What are different things to look for, Phineas?
You know what? The easiest mark is attendance. Kids that are struggling are either not going to be showing up for school like they should, or their disciplinary problems in the school are such that it's red flags and nobody's putting that together. So your best friend is that school counselor to, and you know what? You're looking out for the best interest of the kids. So are they. It's a pretty easy connection. But attendance is boy, that's a red flag. And if you see that red flag, pay attention to it.
I like this part where you have here on the help sheet that it may not be because of their bad acts, but what they're witnessing or experiencing, right?
Exactly. I mean, the trauma of being that unable to respond bystander on the sideline, watching a train wreck happen in front of you with no control is the most helpless feeling in the entire world, whether it's a kid or an adult. So, you know, if they're seeing this stuff and nobody's reaching out to kind of help them get back into the real world, that's a kid that's going to have some problems if we don't help them.
Four decades of law enforcement and EMS experience. What do you want to share about the long-term effects that happen or that they experience?
You know, if you can bring it out and get them able to talk with people and to talk about stuff, that will solve 99% of the issues. There's always going to be a red herring in there that we're not expecting or we're not looking for that might take a little bit longer. But the reality is, if they can talk about it and they can ask for help, and then later in life, they have some place where they can, because oftentimes when their life circumstances change, they get married, they have uh, their first kid gets married, significant impacts in their life, these things will bubble up again. So we don't want to just say, "Hey, we got it all fixed." We want to say, "You know what, you're doing great. But if this starts happening again," and it might, and tell them at some of these significant events, reach back out. We'll help you again. It's a lifelong commitment we're working making to people as a system to keep them healthy.
I want to look at this statistic that's on the help sheet. A male who sees his mother being abused is 10 times more likely to abuse his partner's adult. A female that grows up in a home where the father abuses a mother is 6 times more likely to be sexually abused. Those are that is a horrible those are horrible multipliers, Phineas.
Oh, I mean, you've stacked the deck, we've stacked the deck way against these people, and they haven't even really started in life in their journey. And so it's so important that we're trying to educate and do some community education. I've long been a support of the domestic violence coalitions because we have got to teach our kids, particularly, that what they're seeing is not normal. That schmuck that beats your mom is not the kind of schmuck that you want to get tangled up with. But that's the only person they've been really exposed to in those kind of terms. So we need to be introducing them to concepts of wholesomeness and wholesome and healthy living and wholesome and healthy mental health.
Let's
So
go. Let's go ahead and move now to the second column. Stephanie Neal-Johnson. The topic as we transition, as I slide over just a bit. Now we want to talk about the domestic violence impact on parenting. What do you want to share with us on the right side column?
Well, it's a complicated mishmash of things. I think one of the things that's important to know is that so often the stories that get told, the stories that get reported are negative because they're based on the skew that we find when people are trying to get support and assistance and that sort of thing. So, um, the strategies around managing their health and managing the care of the family needs to probably be reoriented to actually report what people are doing, because what tends to happen is that families are, and mothers in particular, have to overcompensate. And so what we find is that children are cared for as well, if not better, sometimes in those situations where there is abuse, unless there's something else going on. I represented some folks, and there was serious physical engagement, and it was very, very difficult for this mom to focus because she had some traumas and some addictions that made it very, very difficult. And so we see that these parents will nurture and over nurture and care and sometimes do more than you find other parents doing because they don't feel the same level of stress and so forth around caring for their children. But then one of the things that happens is that we find that when when parents who are being victimized remain in these environments, we find some other sets of kinds of behaviors that sometimes present themselves. So if the environment remains abusive, we see that sometimes domestic violence partners are or the victims of domestic violence are really, really violent against their children. And I'm not blaming the victim because I don't think that that is it, but there's a serious amount of stress there. The survival mentality kicks in, and then you find that putting the abuser first phenomenon where the victim tries to kind of keep it quiet and peaceful in the home and ends up lending the control to the abuser and, more than focusing on the children. The other thing that we see is that sometimes the stress is just so much. And so we see the self-medication in the form of drugs and in the form of, other maladaptive behaviors that result in children just not being treated well. I mean, I think of a mother who sleeps almost all day and cannot engage with her children because she's just under so much stress. And then, of course, there are not a lot of good choices in these circumstances. There just really are not. And so sometimes when mothers in particular are trying to minimize further violence, they're making decisions for their children, with their children, about their children that may not be the best choices for the children, but they see them as the best of the bad variety of decisions that they can make under the circumstances. And so it's really a complicated landscape. And many of these children come with their traumas, but their behaviors that suggest that they have been loved, they have been overcompensated for, et cetera, et cetera. But then when we think about the style of the perpetrators, we see this controlling authoritarian behavior coming from them, and this has lifelong impacts on children. And so it intervention is so incredibly important, but undermining and interfering and stress and all of those things become greater stressors and greater sources of trauma for children, as children are being used as part of the game, if you will, of the perpetrator in trying to
And
control everything.
Stephanie Proffitt, I often think of the mistake many attorneys say when I know what you're going through, right?
Mhm.
We have no idea what they're going through, right? We were never in their shoes. We may be able to give some guidance that can help, but what people have gone through, if we assume that we know what we've gone through, then we are just short-circuiting the process to help them in the first place.
Unless you have been through it, which, there are, there are some of us out there that have been in a domestic violence situation, and it's important to know that it doesn't matter how smart you are, doesn't matter how rich you are, it doesn't matter how you were raised. You can end up in a situation where your partner is violent with you, and knowing how to navigate that and knowing how to exit that is certainly very important. And so under the parenting methods, I thought the statistic was pretty interesting that it's interesting the way it's worded, that 26 to 50% of children who have been exposed to domestic violence are functioning as well as those who were not. But think about it in this context. That means 50 to 74% of children who have been exposed aren't functioning well. And so it's a matter of figuring out how to end the abuse, how to stop the cycle, and how, as the victim of the domestic violence, now as a parent, you teach your child to heal. And those things include, first of all, getting yourself together. You need to address what has happened to you. You need to address how you are reacting to what happened to you. Learning how to live in an environment where you aren't the victim of domestic violence, because it's a change. I mean, it's a real difference when you're used to being abused, whether it's physically, emotionally, mentally, or sexually abused by a partner. All of those things, and I'm actually on the blue column, but
You jumped ahead. I was just wanting you to comment on Stephanie Neal-Johnson's stuff. Okay, hold that.
I'll hold that thought.
So, Stephanie, can you help us finish these last two boxes?
Sure. I think we covered parenting style of perpetrators in a sense, and by way of summary, they want to interfere and keep the game leaning in their favor. That's the long and the short of it. But I think it's important to remind everyone and parents, particularly as we support women and other caregivers who are in this position, that there are things that they can do to support themselves and the children. And of course, this comes in the form of a variety of community-based groups and therapy sessions and faith-based organizations, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, to the extent that people can make their way safely to filial therapy, the notion of being taught therapeutic intervention for their children to treat them for the emotional and behavioral difficulties. And I think about the personality formation and all of these things that happen so early on, which, if we're not attentive, can really set a challenging trajectory for children.
Let's go ahead now to the blue column. Okay, so where do you want to pick up, Stephanie Proffitt?
Well, I mean, just going back to that statistic, I think it's very important to understand that as a parent, if your children are being exposed to domestic violence, you're affecting them. Even if you're the victim, they are being affected by your behavior as well as the behavior of the abuser. And the only way you're going to fix that is with therapy and intervention. And that is not just for the children, but for yourself. A parent needs to learn to self-regulate, be aware of their emotions, I represent a lot of children, and I represent a lot of children who are children of, who are third party victims of domestic violence because they see their father beat their mother. And by the way, it goes mom against dad too. They've seen, they see the violence between the two parents, and, how that parent who is the victim reacts really is kind of a pathway for these kids. If mom is, or dad, whoever the victim is crying and they're not, or they're acting out in anger towards their children because they just don't know how to do it. Or like Stephanie said, sleeping all day because they just can't function because they are just so overwhelmed and trying to function and trying to deal with the fact that they probably are suffering from some sort of PTSD for what they're going through. The parent has to really address those things and really needs to seek help, learn how to be optimistic, spiritual, talk to their kids about how can we fix this problem so that it doesn't happen again, and how do we stop this so this isn't the pattern of our life. As Phineas was saying, the number of children who witness family violence who then become either further victims or become perpetrators or become violent criminals is exponential. I mean, it's just unbelievable, the number of those things. And so, first is fix yourself and then fix your kids. And when I say fix, I'm kind of being not very, that's not exactly the right word, but it's get the help for your kids. Get your kids into some therapy. Look to schools. There are school programs at most of the local public schools where they actually have group therapy sessions with kids who get together with other children and they talk about what they've been going through.
Stephanie, how hard is it for us to tell a female client, a mother with children, say, who's the most important person here? Oh, it's my child. And you have to say, no, it's you, because if you can't take care of yourself, and dads get it, right? You say, Dad, you need to put yourself first. Dad's like, okay, I get it, right? Mom's like, I can't do that. It's my child. But if they can't take care of themselves, they're not going to be there to protect their child or children, right? Stephanie Proffitt?
I mean, you have to think about it this way. If you were suffering from some sort of disease, let's say you have cancer, are you going to ignore the cancer and only deal with your children, or are you going to get help for your cancer so that you will be there for your children? And
Right.
so, I often have to tell women and men who are victims of domestic violence that, look, you've got to help yourself. And then what'll happen is you will help your kids. And so, getting the children, into programs, getting them into therapy, figuring out a way to remove yourself from the bad situation. I mean, I have people all the time who hire me, and they come in and they tell me what's happening behind closed doors, and they just don't know how to leave. And they go back and they go back and they go back. And unfortunately, sometimes it ends up with someone is dead. Someone is seriously injured.
Yeah.
Those things are all, you gotta know when it's time to get out.
Let's go ahead and switch to these relationship factors that you have in your column. Can you comment on this box, please?
Sure. So learning how to parent with competency, learning how to accept what is happening, learning how to be responsive when your child says, why did daddy do this? Or why did mommy do this? Knowing the answer, sharing, creating bonds. Sometimes, again, as Stephanie said, mom or dad, usually mom, I mean, let's be statistically fair. Mom is so checked out. She doesn't have a strong parent-child bond because she can't function to do so. Learning how to have self-esteem. You are not a victim. You are now a survivor. So get your self-esteem, work on that. Don't isolate. Don't set your kids up to where your kids think, oh, the only way I can get out, the only way I can survive is to run away. Get your kids knowing that, that they're going to be safe now. Some of the things, that are on here, it's kind of a mashup of stuff, but children who not only do they end up in abusive relationships or become abusers, there's also higher risk of teen pregnancy, dropping out of school, not seeking or getting any type of higher education, health problems, depression, suicidal thoughts and ideation, all of those things, and also being not in good social relationships because they just don't know how. You got to remember that these kids, most of the time, are being told, you don't share what happens in our house with anybody else. So, they're isolated and they don't know what to do. And then you end up with children who are acting out, don't know what to do. And they're, it's the same statistics we see over and over again. They're just not successful in their lives. So, once a parent gets out, they need to know how to take those next steps so that their children are not the 50% to 74% of children who aren't functioning as well as other children not exposed to the situation.
We've got about 5 minutes. Let's make it a round table. When we look at these last things, we'll go Phineas, Stephanie Neal, then Stephanie Proffitt in order on each of these boxes. When we talk about how to mitigate the harm, Phineas, what are your thoughts on where domestic violence meets child abuse?
Well, child abuse isn't necessarily physical always. It also is mental. What I guess I'm going to throw this in as my kind of parting thought is silence and darkness are the two protectors of domestic violence offenders. The more that we can get people in the family to get with people they trust, to let sunshine be the giant cleansing. When the sunshine starts to come in, the clouds leave, the pressure comes off most of these children, and it allows more interaction and more help for the future. So, what we don't want is shrouded in darkness and fog. We want sunshine coming from these people because they trust us to make their world a little bit better. And we need to do our best to do that. But darkness is what makes domestic violence, child abuse, everything else, it empowers people. And what we want to do is empower the good people and unempower the bad people.
Stephanie Neal-Johnson said the victim of domestic violence is not the perpetrator. What comment do you have on that second box that's highlighted?
I could not agree more. And I think on the other side of the coin of what Phineas just said is the notion of education and making sure that the behavior is no longer normalized. I think what we see is a normalization of poor treatment of other people in committed relationships that involve children. And so I think what we see is that people think, oh, well, that's just how they are. Oh, that's just the way it is. And oh, I must remain in this relationship. And oh, in the case of the court system, oftentimes, well, people don't, we don't, they're not doing what they should be doing. And the blame the victim concept comes into play, and people are punished under the law so often. So I think to continue not only to shine the light, but to make sure that everyone in the entire engagement circle, if you will, is educated so that we know what issues to spot, if you will, what behaviors to look for so that we can stop the behavior and everyone can be healthy.
Stephanie Proffitt, Child Protective Services is a terminology that many states in America use, but whatever the name of your agency is in your country, talk to us about perpetrators.
Well, I want to talk. Well, let me just say this. It still is a fact and a thing in CPS in Texas that victims are put into these, they are called, what is the term that they use? Neglectful supervision of children. A parent who is the victim of domestic violence gets an allegation of neglectful supervision if they remain in a relationship with a abuser. And I think that that is absolutely insane. Instead of CPS coming in and saying, look, the perpetrator is solely responsible for the abuse, the victim is not. I have cases right now currently pending where CPS, instead of going to mom and saying, how can we help you? They've gone to mom and said, you are neglectfully, you are guilty of neglectful supervision of your children because you are in a domestic violence relationship. And I just think that that is just so wrong because, you know, the victim should not be made to be the perpetrator. And unfortunately, it still goes on to this day, regardless of what their guideline is.
The second area?
Well, obviously, you know, I talked about this, you know, a few minutes ago. When you're a victim of domestic violence, it 100% intertwines with the child's well-being. And you need to get yourself safe so that you can, you know, so that the child has safety, and that you have safety. And so this is all part of coming up with an exit plan, figuring out how to get out safe, and taking your children away from that situation and getting them help.
Last question for each of you. Phineas, after 4 decades in law enforcement, what do you wish you knew 40 years ago when you were starting out in law enforcement regarding this topic?
I wish, Tom, that we'd had mandatory arrests for domestic violence and we weren't playing this stupid game of who goes to the hotel or motel or mom or dad's, and we'd addressed the stuff head on. I know for a fact it would have prevented a couple of homicides that came about as a result of domestic violence. So we've come a long ways, but we're surely not all the way there yet.
Stephanie, if Neal-Johnson, if you could roll the clock back to back when you and I were in law school together at Boston University, and you
Yes.
start practicing law and you focus on domestic violence in the community, what do you wish you'd known then as an attorney?
Oh my. As an attorney, I wish I understood the the legal implications of the psychology of the people that we're dealing with, because I think so often we just don't get it. And in Massachusetts, judges don't get it, lawyers don't get it. And to Stephanie Proffitt's point, we end up punishing the wrong people, punishing the wrong elements of the circumstance, leaving out the financials where they should go in another direction, or all variety of things that we've seen. From the legal perspective, I think that we should all be trained. This should be a component of our training. And you go back to law school, train us in law school to issue spot and to psychology spot in conjunction with the law.
Stephanie Proffitt, same question to you, but the combining of family law and child welfare law, there's overlap, but there's also real differences, right? Not only in the way that many countries do those cases, the hearings, the procedures. What do you wish you'd known just a few years ago when you were starting out, the differences between family law and child welfare law?
Well, I think the obviously the biggest difference is the government's trying to intervene into your life, and unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize that they need to have legal representation. They need to, do the work when they need to do the work, but they need to fight back when they're wrongfully accused, like a victim of domestic violence being accused of neglecting their children, just because there's a domestic violence situation. I am a huge I very much do not like it when people try to file CPS cases when they're in the middle of a family law matter, in an attempt to try to get a leg up in a case. And that is, there are real victims out there, real victims of child abuse. And when people use the CPS system to try to get a leg up in a family case, it is super frustrating and wrong. And so I'm a firm believer, the thing that's the most important is, if you are a victim, let your lawyer know, let the courts know, let your lawyer fight for you and do what is necessary to protect you and your children. And if you do happen to be one of the people who gets hooked up into CPS because, God forbid, you're a victim of domestic violence and you are now tagged as an abuser, get yourself someone who will advocate for you, who will protect you, and who will help you protect your kids.
And I think also when I started out, I thought no matter what their culture, no matter what their religion, no matter what their language, I could relate to them. And that's not right. That's not right. If someone comes from a Muslim perspective or a Nigerian perspective, or, whether it's faith or language or culture, I may not be the person that's equipped when I try to tell myself, oh, I'm that person, right? And I think the thing I wish I'd known when starting out years ago as a prosecutor, I don't have the answer for everything, and I shouldn't pretend like I do. That's my thought. So what a fun panel. And this concludes our panel on children and resiliency. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.